All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the ChainLinkGod podcast, where we break down the information asymmetry on all things blockchains, oracles, and smart contracts. So today we're going to have a discussion about DAOs, or Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, and specifically the role within the crypto ecosystem and the role within society and some of the benefits and some of the limitations that exist. DAOs have gotten a lot of hype over the past couple of years within crypto as a fundamentally different way to engage in social coordination. And some have even gone as far as to say that DAOs have solved governance once and for all. But as we've kind of seen over time, DAOs are very complex. And at the end of the day, humans are humans. So you have to deal with the human dynamic of people are not perfect. And so struggles always end up occurring. So discuss this topic of DAOs with the Crypto Oracle and I, we have on the podcast Dr. Nick, or Nick Almond. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm great, thanks.
So just to kick things off, could you provide just like a little bit of background on who you are and kind of what your expertise in governance and DAOs are?
Yeah, absolutely. My background's in physics, actually. I spent the first 10 years of my career in physics, ended up as an experimental physicist, kind of realized that wasn't really for me. So went via astrophysics for a couple of years and then ended up teaching maths and cryptography for a little bit at a university as a lecturer, and then sort of slowly drifted into the kind of senior management game there. So I ended up running a lot of master's courses in first maths, then education, so sort of drifted into learning theory for a little bit, and then ultimately you kind of end up in this governance game of how do you manage thousands of people in large institutions. And I sort of started to get interested in decentralized organizations. I built one inside an institution, and sort of got quite excited about that as a paradigm. And then when the DAO happened in 2016, I was already sort of peripherally interested in crypto because of my sort of days of teaching cryptography. And then I've just been down the rabbit hole since. And I actually left a job as an associate dean at the London College of Fashion in about 2020 to set up a startup called Finance.vote, which was a kind of prediction market using quadratic voting, which is still going on. And over the past couple of years, we've been building the DAO infrastructure that we needed around ourselves to become a DAO. And more recently, we've sort of realized we've got a DAO protocol, and we've got a really interesting modular way of building DAOs. And so we're just about to launch that protocol called Factory DAO.
How much is like your previous past influence governance? Like is diving into crypto's governance vastly different than in other fields, or is there a lot of similarities?
There is. I mean, often big institutions are like decentralized organizations, especially kind of universities, because no one wants to be governed, right? So they've got the similar dynamic as decentralized organizations. There's crossover, and I think institutional governance is a better match than, say, corporate governance in a lot of ways for DAOs. So yeah, it massively informs everything I do. I think it really helps being in DAOs if you have been in a role of doing governance stuff in the past, for sure. But it is basically uncharted territory. We're sort of rewriting the book on organization here, I think.
It's funny that you say that, because when I was kind of preparing for this podcast, I was thinking about like, what it like, because when you think about DAOs, it's probably, I think it's good to compare them to something like, CLG said in the opening, like a lot of people were like, oh, DAOs are going to change the world. But also I think the alternative has happened more recently, like where DAOs have gotten like a super negative rap, like they're theater, like they're just, they all suck, And I think though, like, so you have to like kind of compare them to like, different governance structures that exist. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, they're kind of like, in one sense, they're kind of like companies in that, the token holders do, not all DAOs, but a lot of DAOs, like the token holders, they want to see the value of the token go up. So they want to see the protocol do well. They want the foundation, whoever's running it, to have some type of revenue usually, and not always, but I'm just talking about in general. But also they're kind of like governments, because they're kind of governing this kind of public public space, public protocol, or this kind of public good in a way, most of the time, not always though. And they're also kind of like a club too, like some of them, or it's like a social club. So they have these they're not really, I couldn't really pin them down into one, but I guess I don't know a lot about how university governance works, but when I was thinking about them, I kind of bucket them into 3 different areas, but they don't really fall into one category per se.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I think you've really sort of detected that it is a kind of I think it is closer to societal like governance, so government, if you like, mainly because of the dynamics in them. So unlike traditional organizations, people can come and go, and there's a lot more sort of freedom and agency involved than you would get in a traditional like organization. And really they map well to the institutional scale governance because just to the volume and size that they can get to. So you can have many thousands of people wandering in and out of them. So yeah, it's a new governance paradigm for sure. And I think you're right, it does touch on lots of different types of governance from those kind of things, and the club thing works as well. And I think you can draw on things like co-ops and communes and all these kind of things that have happened in the past. It's a bit of a mix of everything, really.
And I think before maybe we go a bit deeper, maybe it might be good to set some context. How would you generally define a DAO, the purpose of a DAO, and kind of the benefits over traditional organizational structures?
Yeah, I tend to kind of, when someone asks me to, what is a DAO, we are at that point in this conversation. I tend to say something different every time. I'm trying to pin it down, and I'm in the process at the moment of talking to people like lawyers and regulators and other DAO operators and so on about this. And I've counted 50, 60 different definitions out there. At the high level, I like to think of them as we're basically the goal is to try and reconceptualize organization for the digital world. The digital world is a kind of different plane of existence almost to kind of IRL governance. So that's happening. They're almost like digital coordination hubs on the internet. And, at one level, it's kind of humans meet smart contracts. But the definition I'm sort of landing on is that DAOs are like sociotechnical systems, and they use decentralized technologies to achieve autonomy and social coordination around digital assets. So that's kind of my current definition at the moment. And the important bit is this sociotechnical bit. It's smart contracts are kind of purely automated code. But when you add humans back into it, it creates this new dynamic of, humans and machine interacting in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to how I was defining it. I like that word, sociotechnical. I didn't come up with that, but it was kind of on one end, really all a DAO is doing is collectively making decisions about something. It's trying to do that in a more distributed, transparent, and I would say trust minimized manner. And I think to do that, it brings in this technical element of blockchains, particularly smart contracts, to you're basically using a more tamper-proof, transparent type of software to codify the rules and structures. And so, and that obviously has benefits, of making it very I think the ultimate benefit, the more I look into it, is really that how the system works. And it might not work good, it might work great, it might not work great, but at least you how it works, as long as there's people who can read the code. And then obviously there's some other benefits, but that's kind of what I landed on too. You make decisions, then you're using this kind of new software that's more transparent and can be built in a tamper-proof way or run in a tamper-proof manner, which is really the distinct feature of DAOs, is this anchoring to blockchains. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think there's again, there are these fluid ideas. If you go back to the original DAO idea, the DAO was essentially a smart contract that allowed people to pool money together and then conduct a kind of election on where that money got sent to. So it was almost like a decentralized fund of sorts. And that's the kind of, DAO 1.0 idea. We pool money together and we vote on where it goes, and the rules are set in the smart contract, and that's what it is. It does what it does. But they can be a lot more. They can branch into much more different codified rule sets, and we're getting into this world where there's like a set of smart contracts, like you've got DeFi contracts, and you've got these other different modular components, but ultimately you have this kind of algorithmic component that people are coordinating around.
You mentioned the DAO, which was pretty infamous in 2016 when there ended up being a bug in the code and ended up getting drained and the Ethereum network forked. And it seems like there's kind of a schism or a dichotomy where on one end of the spectrum, people believe that code is law, where everything needs to execute according to the code. And it seems like a lot of DAOs are kind of on the other side of the spectrum, where it's more down to social consensus. And if the community agrees to a change, then the code can be changed. Do you think that DAOs inherently don't follow code as law, or do you think that's part of a DAO is code as law, but then the human dynamic isn't? Like, how do these two concepts interplay? Are they incompatible, or can they be reconciled?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I wrote a piece on this just over a year ago, which I called governance optimization. And you've got the two ends of the spectrum, right? So governance minimization is basically the Bitcoin way. And the kind of code as law paradigm came out of this governance minimization idea that, you ossify these rules into code, they're immutable, they're on the blockchain, they're not supposed to change under, pain of death. There's 21 million Bitcoins and that can never change. And that's fine and works for, Bitcoin if you're trying to just do one thing. But if you, as you start to try and get more complex and do more adaptive and agile things, then you need governance. And it's about finding this balance. So the two ends of the spectrum, like governance minimization, is that you basically code as law, you never change it, eliminate humans from the game as much as possible. The opposite end of this is like governance maximization. We're just, all we're doing is governing. It's just relentless meetings, decisions. We're changing all the time. And for me, there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle where you use the affordances of blockchain technology to like freeze bits of process into code that work, and then only iterate them when there's like a significantly new way of doing it that you can pivot to. So there's a sweet spot in between, I think, so you can get the sort of best of both worlds, if you like.
I guess this is a really hard question to answer. I don't expect you to have a perfect answer, but I guess what a lot of people will say is, once you open Pandora's box where you can just change stuff based on social consensus, is that just going back to kind of what we had before? What we have now is, that humans can just change it when they want. Is that opening Pandora's box too much? Or I think it's inevitable. And to the, I don't know, it's just a very, it's hard to like get both, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what governance is all about, really. It's how do you adapt without corrupting the system so it collapses? And really, the more you open the door to changes, the more likely you get these kind of like black swan events where, it gets corrupted, it gets captured, gets taken over, it collapses for whatever reason. But the alternative is you kind of are in stasis all the time. So yes, there's a potential that things can go wrong and humans be humans and break everything. But you need to take risks if you're governing. If you want to do something different, then you need an adaptable rule set. So good governance will build frameworks and clear processes and protocols around making those changes, but minimizing the risks of it.
I agree with what you said there, of like having very clear processes and very clear delineation of what can be changed, what can, and also finding that sweet spot of like how much consensus needs to be changed and engaging that based on how big of a change that is or how important of a change that is probably going to be extremely important. I guess just, what would you say right now is like, what would you say the general sentiment on the current state of DAOs is?
I think there's two things here. One is like, what's my sentiment on it, and then what the sentiment of the market is, what everyone else thinks. I'm basically a permabull when it comes to DAOs. I think that this is a radical new paradigm for organization, and organizations like the building blocks civilization. It's like we're trying to do something really significant and change the fundamental ways that we organize. And however, I do recognize that this is it's early, right? These are emerging technologies. So emerging technologies are, they're typically not as good as the thing it's trying to disrupt for a long time. So you can look at all sorts of technological development over the years and look at things like the digital camera was basically invented in like 1975 by a guy called Steve Sasson at Kodak, and it could do like 50 by 50 pixel pictures, and everyone, including Kodak, said that's terrible, that's never going to work. And it took 20 years to get to the point where we had or even longer, 25 years, when we had a 1 megapixel digital camera that could even get close to rivaling film. And I think we're in that stage of DAOs. We're in this, they're clunky, messy, suboptimal compared to the centralized ways of doing things. But when the disruptive moment happens, you'll get this like exponential growth out when the foundation of the tooling's there. We'll start to see them radically improve on the conventional way of doing things, and you'll get this kind of exponential sort of fly out of it. But many at the moment don't really see that far out. We're just looking at what's happening now, and every week you can look at some DAO-based disaster, and it's going wrong, and it's easy for people to say, look, this is never going to work. DAOs are a bad idea. People can't govern things, and we shouldn't trust them to. And the sort of prevailing sentiment isn't at the moment, DAOs will never work. And then you've got this interesting emerging sentiment where people are sort of suggesting, we should just import corporate governance into them, get the board of directors in, have managers, install authority chains, and basically just copy the company world inside DAOs, which I find kind of troubling as well, to be honest. But so people are not I think there's a subset of people who really, they're DAO pilled, right? They get it. They know where it's going. They know how disruptive they can be, and can see past the current sort of state of things. But it's totally understandable that people are sort of not quite convinced yet.
Yeah, I would agree that most technologies start out in a very primitive form, almost trying to get initial product market fit. And you mentioned like some of the DAOs kind of have clunky, and some of them are kind of have issues. What do you see as like the larger issues that existing DAOs today have run into that have kind of caused this more negative sentiment that DAOs are not ideal?
I think there's we've got these kind of rigid frameworks for DAOs at the moment, so they're kind of slightly hamstrung with what they're capable of doing. So we've still got some quite rigid DAO structures, which are basically these elaborate multi-sigs. What we're doing is voting on where this money goes, and then what happens with the money after that is it's a bit of a black box. We send money to these people, they may or may not perform, and we're missing the kind of follow-on from where that money goes. So someone gets a grant and there's not that much follow-up from it. So we're missing that sort of second layer of governance that goes into chasing down a product output from where it goes. But there's also these like failures of trust. We're still using, a multi-sig and snapshot for like 90% of DAOs. So that we still fall back on this trust point where actually there's still 5 people, let's say, on a multi-sig that actually have the say over everything. So we've got kind of incomplete trust models at this point, I would say, and we've still not quite cracked the social consensus machinery that's necessary to be able to effectively listen to, let's say, 1,000 people and convert that signal into coherent output. So we've just not quite got the new paradigm of tools required for listening to this kind of disorganized mob of people and turning it into a coherent output. So consequently, what we've got is a lot of really messy, uncoordinated DAOs where the people are waiting around for things to happen and no one's picking them up and all these sort of things. So yeah, they're a bit early, and some are even catastrophically die due to things like governance attacks. And you only need to see a few of these before people think, this doesn't work.
I guess what I always wonder though is, like you were talking about, a few things, like you had mentioned previously about like hierarchical structures. Like to me, it seems very hard to run a complex protocol organization. I'm going to focus more on protocols for a sec. Like it's a very complex things. There aren't that many people that really understand them and they could make highly educated decisions. Like a lot of people that maybe just hold the token, like a lot of them really only want the price to go up in the short term. And not all of them, I'm just generalizing, but that's their primary focus. So like, I really wonder how first off, how many people actually want to participate in a protocol DAO? I don't know how many people. I feel like a lot of people, they just want it to work well and they don't actually want to, because like being in a DAO, and actually a utopian type DAO that we would all love, is like everyone has to kind of take responsibility. They got to spend time. They may even have to expend resources to really understand what's going on. Also, not to mention to help drive adoption, help to get partners to work with the protocol. So like, it seems to me like, how do you first off get responsibility? Like who's going to take responsibility to do all these roles? Like it seems like you need some type of a hierarchical structure for that to work. And all, like, or else like I've seen like these really flat structures where it just like synthetics try this and then they kind of move to this kind of Spartan council role, and it seems like it's worked more efficiently for them. And so I guess I guess a couple, like how many people actually want to participate in DAOs, and also like how do you get things done with having a super flat organizational structure?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's so I think perfectly flat organizations are a bit of a myth. There's always hierarchy. There's always a kind of asymmetry in power in any organization, just through the fact that some people are more committed or that some people have better ability to achieve the organizational goals. And sort of pretending that hierarchy isn't there can lead you to this kind of like tyranny of the structurelessness problem, which is the power just manifests in ways that are destructive, and it just falls to the kind of more implicitly powerful people.
You basically have a power vacuum, or you could have a tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of just all ends in infighting, and people, somebody steps up and starts to assume the kind of responsibility and bosses everyone around. It all kind of collapses fairly quickly because it turns kind of toxic. So yeah, there's no such thing as a perfectly flat org. So it's more about creating hierarchies that are explicitly codified and are not fixed. So the problem with traditional organizations is that people kind of drift up into this upper management sort of top of the pyramid sort of area of the organization, and then just sort of protect their positions. And they quite often, they've battled their way up there and they hit this kind of inertia point and they become fixed. And that's when, things start to just get slow and clunky because you've just got these people stuck at the top. But there is necessarily always going to need to be some separation of the people who are more directly committed to the organization than not. So I like to think of it, they're almost like a sphere of contribution, where you've got like the core in the middle and out towards the mantle and the crust, like the kind of earth structure diagram. And the crust might be 30,000 people, but it's a thin amount of contribution. And the goal is to create clear and obvious paths to becoming a core member. And the route to doing that is through, incentivization. We are in a financial paradigm, and people will do that, and people will step up and participate and contribute if it makes financial sense for them to do so. So we need to generate these processes for flowing the crypto assets, the reserve crypto assets from the DAO to the people who have contributed the most. And if the DAO starts to perform, the protocol starts doing well, then the token captures the value, then everyone who holds the assets that they've earned will benefit from that proportionally to how much work they've done.
That's kind of the more I've thought about it, is like, it seems to me the best model that I think will eventually happen is you'll have kind of this, it's kind of how the US was supposed to be, was originally set up. I don't know if it's necessarily how it works today, but where you kind of have this, but there's some differences. One, you'd have kind of a representative democracy where you have kind of this leadership structure that makes that, whether it's a foundation or that basically does the day-to-day operations, but then they are accountable to this larger DAO, and the DAO can override them if they want, maybe by like a supermajority consensus. And then I also think you may have some huge decisions that are made by the DAO directly, and they don't go directly through the more hierarchical structure. And I do agree with you that it's really important to, you need like upward mobility in the DAO in some form. Like, people have to like perform, or they can be replaced, and you have to have some way for people to replace them so they're just not embedded in there, like you said before. So like having some, and I think this gets into a deeper topic of like maybe something like soulbound tokens or something, where like, how do you gain reputation in a DAO in not just a financial manner, where then you can actually move upward in the DAO. Especially if you're popular within the DAO, and assume a leadership position, as opposed to it being some fixed thing that only the largest token holders have, or only if the founders have. But I do see it as this kind of representative structure that's kind of anchored to this, basically more accountable at the end of the day. Like today, the government is not really that accountable to people. Like, it's very hard to like get things overturned. Like, it takes such a massive effort, especially with how the news cycle works and everything. Like, to give people to get a sustained political cause going is so hard. It seems like, but DAOs are much more agile, where if like there is a big uproar about something, you can get change quicker. And so that's what I kind of see the DAO is. But then you also have this kind of leadership structure, so you can be efficient like an actual company, because I think you need to be as well.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in there. I think I kind of hope we bypass this kind of representative democracy phase, because it kind of evidently doesn't work that well in the real world. I mean, it kind of becomes this popularity contest where you could imagine just, a handful of influencers running all the DAOs because they've got big Twitter accounts or something. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. I think there's going to be definitely, this, liquid democracy ideas is definitely something that's been in the DAO zeitgeist for quite a long time, where you can quite fluidly direct your token votes to some representatives in the DAO, and they can form these leadership sort of dynamics. And I do think leadership is an important concept for DAOs. I think, traditional organizations have this very management type structure where you've got, some boss above you in sort of tiers that's making sure you deliver your work to specification, and you're basically subordinate to that person. And I think actually DAOs are much more in the kind of leadership way, because DAOs run on kind of local autonomy. So I think one of the key delineations is that the freedom and agency and local autonomy is central to the DAO idea. You can leave whenever you want. It's not like a traditional organization where you're bound by some contract and you have to do what your manager tells you to. So leadership.
But is that a positive? Or I mean, I think there's some positive, but I also think there's some negatives in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a different paradigm, right? Everything's got its trade-offs. So I wrote a piece on this a couple of weeks ago where DAOs, because they have this much more fluid population, because they have these different voices, because they're more dynamic and fluid in their nature, in who's participating, who's doing their work, you get more sort of diversity, interconnectedness within the DAOs, and you get more emergence and more problems, but more emergent productivity as well. So that they're places of innovation, in the sense they can be much more creative than a conventional organization, because you get this flow of new voices coming into the organization in a consistent manner. But with that comes, considerable problems as well. So yeah, it's all a trade-off space. You can't win completely.
I do agree you get this flow of information. I think the problem though becomes like, who then takes that flow of information and then turns it into action? And if there's not this like person that like, this is our responsibility to basically take this, put it into action, and like kind of lead the charge in a way, then it just like becomes this very slow and inefficient process that doesn't
kind
go
of too many cooks problem. Right?
And then how does it compete with much more agile structures?
So for me, this is very much the problem we've been working on for the last few years, is the paradigm becomes more about curation. So you've got all these ideas, everyone wants to do something differently. You need social consensus tools that can collect all these ideas, and then through kind of democratic processes. I'm a big fan of voting technologies, even though Vitalik's kind of gone a bit against coin voting. I'm still very bullish on it, and use them to curate the best ideas to the top. So you need organizations that, the processes that make the best ideas float to the top. And once they gain enough traction, they get funding and then get operationalized. So it's when money gets involved that someone can then come up and convert that to a productive outcome. So you have to like curate all these different ideas, which is quite unconventional in traditional organizations, where you wouldn't necessarily everyone doesn't necessarily have a voice on how the whole organization should run.
Yeah, there's kind of like a weird dichotomy of like, DAOs are ultra decentralized, maximally decentralized, and then they move too efficiently, but then centralized organizational structures, they can move a lot more agile, but then there's no checks and balances. And it seems like there's some projects end up living in kind of like an uncanny valley, where they have a protocol company, like a labs company, that basically does the development work. They launch a token to create a DAO, and they basically have this DAO that owns its own tokens that they can then have the token holders vote to determine who gets grants from those tokens, and then ideally does protocol work. But there ends up becoming a dichotomy of, if this protocol becomes valuable, does the value accrue to the governance tokens in the DAO, or does it accrue to the labs company and their equity that exists? And so it seems like this may not be an entirely sustainable model, and it's kind of a weird, they have a DAO, but they don't necessarily have full control or full value capture of the protocol they generate. And it's almost like there's a conflict between the centralized labs entity who created the protocol and then the DAO and the token that it issued. Is this like a sustainable model? Is this realistic for projects to pursue? Because it does seem like some projects have ended up going down this route intentionally or otherwise.
Yeah, I think you're entirely spot on. And there's this interesting tension between these different entities. So you'll quite often, so if you take like Yuga Labs model, for example, you've got an NFT that generated a lot of money. Then you've got a company, so which is the Yuga Labs company, and then you've got the Ape DAO, I think it's called, with the token. And it is very much up in the air where the value flow gets captured. There's a tension between, does the value generated by the product go to the company? Does it go to the token? Does it go to the NFTs? And I actually think this is kind of like the nexus of the next era of corporate governance. I think we're going to have the interplay between, and I think they'll trend towards hybrid decentralized organization structures. I think there's things that DAOs are good at, and I think there's things that companies are good at. I don't think this is like a paradigm that means that we don't have LLCs in 20 years' time. It means we have two different paradigms of governance that we can play off synergistically. So DAOs are good at this in context, exploratory work with, community members being directly at the heart of it. They're kind of more innovative in nature, they're more fluid and agile, but what you end up with is unpredictable outcome. You might get, heartbreaking work of staggering genius one day and absolutely nothing for 3 months. Whereas companies, they deliver stuff on regimented outputs, they deliver products to specification, to deadlines. And I think that's where the interplay will be formed out. These models have kind of emerged out of necessity almost. In some cases, it's purely so you can raise money on equity and on tokens. In some cases, it's for regulatory reasons. But we've not really got to the point where we formalize the relationship between these entities that is, that's right and sensible for the protocols yet. But I do see a path to some interesting new structures emerging over the next few years.
Yeah, I would agree with you that it's really beneficial in a way to, you have this kind of DAO that's tasked more with kind of like more of just like it's kind of like, I guess, like a governance role in a way, but it's not really like a typical company role per se. Like they're not delivering things, but they're helping curate, like you said, like who's going to deliver those things, which you can basically kind of outsource that, whether that's to the development company or that's to third parties through grants. But going off of something you said before, I'm curious, why do you like token weighted voting? Because for me, I go back and forth because, on one end, obviously everyone, the problem people throw out with token weighted voting is that obviously, the whales can just control it. Basically the founders and the early VCs, they get the most tokens because they're the ones who created it and they're the ones who invested in it early, which, I mean, at the end of the day, why shouldn't they? I mean, considering they took all the risk and they put up the capital to create it, but then, why would new people join if it's just a token way to vote? But so it's like, I'm curious why you like token weighted voting and how you think, because I can actually probably kind of like it, but I think it just needs to be balanced with like new forms of on-chain reputation. So it's like, it's a dual model. It's not token weighted voting is bad, but it's not the only thing that should be within this kind of decision-making structure.
Yeah, I mean, where your head's at on it is exactly where mine is too. It's so yeah, I mean, there's been a backlash against it, and it's something that I've been very aware of for quite a long time. That one coin, one vote trends to this pure plutocracy, right? Where the biggest token holders, and wealth is power law distributed, so you've got this kind of like long tail of holders who have fraction of what a handful of large token holders have, and you can see this in so like the example I always bring up is the compound system. So there's 198,000 comp holders and 12 people vote, and it's like A16Z, Paradigm, and whoever else is in there, and some universities and stuff who've been assigned as delegates. So it clearly doesn't work as a system that brings in a large amount of participants because they're fundamentally disempowered against these large token holders. So yeah, you're right.
Do you think though, do you think a lot of those people though actually want to participate?
Yeah,
or
I think
they feel empowered, or they just don't really want to participate that much, or maybe they just got free comp tokens because they liquidity mined before and they don't really care that much.
I think if there was a clear path into the organization and it was valuable for them to do it, I think there is, we've managed to recruit a large amount of community holders in our DAO over the last couple of years, and it's because we put a lot of effort into creating opportunities for them to participate and earn some more tokens for it. So, you take that 200,000 token holders, and a small percentage will actually want to turn up and get involved in DAO business and work there. And some would turn up more often to vote if their vote actually meant something, or if the outcome of that vote had a meaningful impact on their sort of participation in the system. So it's a lot of it's about disempowerment, and to sort of come back to the point of like how you can sort of fix these things a little bit. One of the things that you can do is quadratic voting, which smooths out the impact. It sort of limits the weighting of your impact based on your holdings. And there is civil resistance issues in that. But there is mechanisms out there for smoothing out the impact of these high weighted token holders. But really, yeah, I think pure token voting, pure plutocratic token voting has its place. I mean, it makes sense that the people who have the most skin in the game should have a large impact in the DAO. And if you look at, say, Curve DAO, for example, that's a kind of governance minimized DAO that comes down to like crypto economic like power games almost. So it comes down to like pure financial might. And for some protocols, that makes the most sense, particularly DeFi protocols. But when you start moving away from these sort of pure financial games and you want to build more sort of elaborate organizations, then you're going to need different mechanisms. And the thing that I'm most interested in at the moment is NFT governance. So with NFT governance, you can have an NFT that represents your identity within the DAO. And again, we've developed a kind of quadratic voting process for this, where every NFT gets a budget of voting power. And what it allows you to do then is attribute different amounts of voting power to different actors in the DAO. So you can say token ID number 85 can have 3x the voting power of token ID 150, for example, and they might have earned that. So that gets you into this reputation system and non-financial governance game, which I think is the kind of next major era of decentralized governance.
Actually, just real quick, I think you really hit on a point there that I feel like I've been coming to, in that I just think there's really different protocols or DAOs or whatever should have different forms. Like there's some DAOs that I think, like you said, should just be pure, like probably could just be pure financialization, like pure power games where money talks. There's other ones where honestly, if the governing body is doing well, I don't actually mind if they run it. But then there's other ones, especially when you get into these, and maybe this hasn't happened a lot yet because we haven't really seen these kind of more social layer protocols really take off. Like people have thought about like social media and some of these other ones, but also like core infrastructure layers might be best for this. But this moving beyond financialization, like you said, with NFTs, with things like on-chain reputation. So like there's other ones where I really want to participate more. So it's like almost like I feel like it's important for projects like to think a lot about like what type of DAO maybe is right for their protocol, because not all of them really need to be like maximum participation from a huge audience. Like some maybe run more centralized, but people may be fine with that. And I think there'll be a lot of different, like some might do well in that model, others might not, and it'll be interesting to see how those kind of evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly my thesis on it. Really, there's decentralization is a continuum, right? And there's going to be DAOs that work best with pure, hyper financialization, crypto economic games, and then there'll be some that work best with like almost pure egalitarian, one NFT per person, flat voting hierarchies, with reputation systems in the middle. Some will work better with SBTs, some will work better without. And I think there's going to be there's a really expressive design space that we'll spend the next, couple of decades figuring out what kind of organizations work best with different paradigms.
Seems like in the hybridization model, like if you want a system that's in the middle where you have some financialization and you want some level of reputation system, that's if you want to be able to award participants, not just in a governance manner or in a reputation-based manner, but being able to have initiatives where if you do work for the DAO, you can earn additional governance tokens, or you earn some NFT. I guess the challenge really becomes, how do you reward the participants who do honest work and reward them while trying to disincentivize mercenary capital or just mercenary actors who just want to farm the system, where they do the bare minimum amount of work to try and maximize their own personal rewards? Like, is there any method where we could find a happy medium, or is it just there's going to have to be some mercenary capital who latch on to the people trying to do honest, genuine work for the DAO?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll be publishing something on exactly this later in the week. There's I call it a continuum of contribution. You've got, I think there'll be DAOs that do almost kind of mechanical Turk work, so you've got these like micro tasks that people can turn up and do. That's like your airdrop farmers. There's going to be jobs that will help DAOs that are very easily trackable, farmable things. And that's cool. That's fine. That's at the lowest part of it. And then you can build these. We've got an app we call Bank, which is for distributing tokens to many thousands of people using sort of Merkle trees. And then as you move out, you start to have to introduce trust back into the system. So we have this idea of like DAO basic income, where you come in, you've helped around, you've proven yourself to be a contributor, and we will give you almost like 3 months of stipend in stable coins. And if you turn up and do work and it's cool, we'll give you another 3 months. And eventually you can start to extend the amount of time that you're giving them on trust. So you start to have to integrate trust back into the game, where it's like, look, we trust you to turn this up. We're not going to manage you. I'm going to watch you do this, but you turn up and deliver. And you can start to extend trust out iteratively to participants over time. And eventually you can imagine where, like, look, we're just going to give you 2 years salary up front because we know you're going to participate and you're a high value contributor, that we want you to come and work for us. And then there's lots of different iterations in between, from everything from curation games, where we can pay out people based on the quality of the work that they've done, and that's determined by vote. And there's a whole sort of spectrum of different payout systems that we can build with DAOs that are very different to what you would get in a traditional organization.
It's almost like, from how I view it, is like DAOs will develop a reputation. Basically, if they contract work out to different entities, and they, how fair they'll make decisions on whether, how they handle the relationships with people that they distribute funds to. And if the general consensus is they operate in a fair and, logical manner, they'll gain kind of a social reputation. Like, basically their social consensus has a strong social reputation in a way. And then more people will want to join that DAO, or will trust that DAO is acting in good faith, and they'll want to be a part of it, where there'll be other DAOs that, say someone does work for them and they didn't get compensated fairly or whatever, they just develop a bad reputation over time, and less people want to join that DAO, and that protocol or whatever is not as successful. Seems like it's not like something you can directly codify. It's like more of just like a reputation thing, which really is inevitable anyways to integrate within, DAOs and with blockchain and smart contracts.
Yeah, and I think this is what a lot of the kind of SBT DSOC narrative is about, is trying to codify that sociality, that emergent sort of reputation. So you could imagine having an NFT that keeps a record of your contribution. So you've got almost like a portfolio of work that follows you around with your NFT, and you've consistently delivered over and over and over again, and that builds you a kind of reputation attached to your NFT that you can take with you to other DAOs. And yeah, I think you hit on an interesting point there, which is, as the DAO itself will have a reputation for consistently paying people efficiently and being fair about its compensation. I think that's a really interesting point.
It's kind of like, companies, they have like, they have a general, it's not like written somewhere, but like there's a general consensus on whether they, have a good product or service that people like, and either they get more business or they don't. And it seems like that's just how they will work. So it will really come down to the people within the DAO. If you have the right people in the DAO and you have a good culture and a lot of, people just pick up on that over time, and that becomes a more popular DAO. Whereas other ones that don't have a good culture, that don't have the right leaders or the right people influencing it, then it won't be as successful.
Yeah, I think in many ways DAOs are a kind of raw form of community in that sense. It's like DAOs are I would say DAOs are an abstraction of people, and whereas the company is a kind of facade. It's like a black box. Like what is Facebook? It's this closed box that you have to apply to get into if you want to participate. Where DAOs are very much more social and community centric, and consequently will be, judged and as successful based on what people are in there and who the contributors are, and whether people are having a good time and enjoying themselves participating in it.
Right, and they're like rapidly transparent. Like,
Yes.
all the conversation is on a forum for everyone to see, and like, then you have all crypto Twitter, and like it's a very different way of operating. Do you think like traditional companies will become DAOs, or you think, what people say that, like, what are your thoughts about that?
I think I can imagine some big companies having DAOs as part of their organizational structure. I think we'll see DAOs that will rival the size of some of the largest organizations in the future. But yeah, I think I can well imagine, and not too far into the distant future, we'll see organizations exploring having DAO components within their organization, because they'll be more effectively able to mediate overseas workers, people from one of the things about DAOs is that they're implicitly international and global. And they will develop processes that help you mediate very transient work. So you can imagine like digital nomads all over the world sort of plugging into a DAO to deliver the work that they want. And I think there's a huge amount of human capital out there in the world that wants to be transient, doesn't want to come and sign a contract that promises that they're going to turn up 9 to 5 every day for the foreseeable future. That want to be able to play multiple roles at once in different organizations. And I think organizations will be able to, using DAOs, capture that human capital and increase their productivity because of it.
And know that, like, when looking, at least I've dived more into like almost like the governance structure of blockchains, how there's almost like a rage quit type option where if the minority disagrees with the majority, they can fork themselves off and basically run their own version, or at least that's the idealistic approach, although it's not really practical with unforkable aspects of blockchains. But is there a dynamic within DAOs where the minority can hold the majority accountable, like a checks and balances type system? Like, I assume reputation will play a large role in that, but it seems like regardless of the DAO structure, there's kind of often a dynamic where if the majority, or at least the influential, agree with something, the minority realistically can't do much beyond just leaving and spinning up their own DAOs. So like, are DAO forks, not like the DAO fork, but DAO forks in general, is that a realistic concept, or is that anything DAOs have approached thus far?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, but I think so one of the real innovations of the Moloch DAO pattern, which is a wonderful DAO design, is that there is this rage quit function. So you can contribute funds to the treasury, and if a proposal passes that you don't agree with, there's a period of time post vote where you can leave the DAO and take your funds with you, and you literally just call a rage quit function. And I think there will be iterations of that. I think, can a DAO fork is a really interesting question. And yeah, I think it could. You could well imagine a very contentious decision in the DAO that splits the community, 50-50 one way or another. And it's entirely plausible that they could fork, generate their own tokens, and just fork off into a different organization. Those communities can take the path in a different direction. So yeah, I think fork-based consensus is definitely something that has a future in DAOs. So yeah, and it is the kind of blockchain way of resolving disputes, and I think there's definitely going to be that will carry over into DAOs eventually.
Yeah, I suppose at the other end of the spectrum beyond forking is basically mergers and acquisitions. I know the Rari DAO was merged with the Tribe DAO, and that was kind of a whole thing that where not everyone was necessarily happy because of different varying exchange rates. But do you foresee, like with this topic of like DAO composability and reputation transferring across DAOs, are we likely to see more DAOs and merging with each other, or is that like such a complicated type situation that either DAO may not be fully happy with the decision?
Yeah, I think we will, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some in the near future, with everyone kind of struggling with their treasuries at the moment. I mean, one of the concepts I'm very interested in is like meta DAO structures, where you have this overarching DAO governance system that can either incubate DAOs within itself. So Factory DAO will have a number of sub DAOs that do these different, almost like departmental like structures. So sub DAOs, and so some DAOs might benefit from operating within a very stable, larger organization, and for that they can take a subset of their tokens, pay some of their revenue or profits back to the main DAO to do that. So I think we'll see some of that dynamic. We might even see a very large DAO structure turn up that basically absorbs smaller DAOs within itself. And I think, yeah, we'll see more things like, the Rari things was a little bit of a mess, but it was basically the first of its kind that I've seen. But yeah, I think and they can be networked as well. I think we'll see people talk about this DAO to DAO sort of end game, where DAOs network with each other to share resources and services and people and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I can well imagine these things start to network up and merge and become, they're like very organic structures. So I would absolutely anticipate that to happen.
It reminds me of a couple of things. One, what you just said there kind of reminds me of like Balaji's talk of like network states, and then these network states recognizing one another and trading with one another and doing business. But it really gets to something that I've thought about before DAOs, just in governance in general, this idea of scale. On one end, I feel like when you're thinking about DAOs, like scale is extremely important to how you even think about constructing a DAO. I feel like a lot of smaller DAOs that have basically a more, like you have a bunch of people that are very similar, to be honest, and it's about a homogenous culture there, and they have a very specific focus that can be quite successful because they're all like very aligned and very into the one thing they're doing. But as you get these kind of DAOs, like say if Ethereum was a DAO, or say these just like a big platform that encompasses a lot of different types of people from all around the world, a lot of different opinions, maybe even a multitude of different services and sources of revenue, it becomes like extremely hard to run a DAO like that. I'm curious, like, what you think about particularly like larger DAOs, like how they would operate, because to me that's going to be by far the hardest, and almost prefer like a more of a minimized type of governance, or maybe something where there's like a bunch of sub DAOs within a meta DAO, and the meta DAO has much more limited function, kind of like how the United States was supposed to be set up, where you have a much more limited federal government, but then you have more states running themselves. I'm just curious how you think about these like massive, like large DAOs.
Yeah, I think we'll see. I think DAOs can eventually hyperscale. So like scale up to like, once they've cracked the processes for contribution, translation is going to be a huge piece of it. And with AI developing the way it is, there's going to be mechanisms, and these are digitally native spaces. So I do think we'll see absolutely gigantic DAOs. I think that's one of the things that makes them so exciting, is that because they are sort of non-corporeal in a sense, they're not bound by brick and mortar. They could scale to like monumentally huge organizations. But with that comes exactly the point that you raised there, which is you start to have more people to manage. So you've got these lots of divergent interests and perhaps competing interests and different cultural paradigms and all of these things. And this is where social consensus tools start to become really important. So one of the things that we've developed is, again, using this quadratic voting. Instead of saying, shall we do this, yes or no, we have this kind of emergent governance process where we can say, here's a list of all the things we can do, which should we do? And we get this kind of consensus sorted list of priorities. So you have a much more nuanced voting system, which captures more diverse inputs. So people feel disempowered where, there's a proposal's gone up and it's, shall we do this, yes or no? And most people didn't even want they don't know where the proposals come from, and it doesn't mean anything to them. And they weren't involved in the process. So you need processes that capture huge amounts of people's insights and desires, and also dialogue. So one of the things I think it's important is when you're voting is to be able to say why you voted that way. So you build these rich streams of information that are gathered from many thousands of people. So you can have this constant stream of what people think across the organization, and their opinions are effectively captured. And the good DAOs will operationalize and capture and respond to as much of those opinions and desires as much as possible. So it'll really come down to cracking these governance templates, ossifying these processes that people can understand at scale, cracking contribution processes so you can pay out millions if you wanted to, and making sure you've got systems that allow you to listen to all of those people and make them feel meaningfully heard in the system.
So yeah, I almost think like I do think I guess you could have a massive DAO, but I almost think the best way to do that is to actually just where a lot of people who are quite alike join. I mean, I obviously they're going to have differences in opinion on some things, but I feel like if you like, some protocols won't have this choice because they'll just be like back-end infrastructure for everything, and it'd be very hard to, you just will have a wide range of people. But I feel like, I just feel like it'd be very hard to. I just feel like it would fracture. A DAO would fracture big time if you didn't have a lot of people that were fairly aligned. I think that's what makes like countries powerful, when a lot of people are aligned together and they have a kind of a single like a identity and a shared culture. That's what makes them powerful. That's what makes political parties powerful. That's what makes any club powerful. Like, if you try to attract lots of different cultures and different ways of thinking, it just becomes kind of a mess. And obviously there are some positives where you get a lot of different types of feedback and stuff, but also, I mean, look at the polarization now with all the different cultures coming together. Like, it just seems hard to do in a way. Although I do think that, say you take Ethereum and it was a DAO, like, you wouldn't really have a choice. Like, there'd be some protocols that are just so massively used and big that they'll have to learn how to deal with this. But I feel like a lot of I could see like some big investment ones or like social type club ones that just become really big because they just have this like culture that everyone is into in a way.
Yeah, I think the cultural alignment's like definitely a huge thing. And I think this is why you need to be able to have the systems for collecting what are our shared values, like what is the culture that we can all align around. And remember, there's going to be like thousands of DAOs all along the site, so you can essentially just gravitate to the DAO that best aligns with your values. So I think you're absolutely spot on. You need that cultural framework that everyone sort of get behind and identify with. But again, like, they will fracture, and I think you can use sub DAOs actually using fractal governance structure, where you could be in a DAO with 10,000 people, but ultimately who you're collaborating with is a small group of people in your little sub DAO, or nano DAOs, as I call them, that might even run on trust. There's no necessarily voting, but you get some funding to go and do that thing that you guys have decided to collaborate on. So breaking huge, massive groups down into subgroups where people have very tight alignment is definitely a way that DAOs could hugely scale.
It does seem like beyond there being like a difference in culture and way of thinking that could end up creating a lot of friction. But it seems like some DAOs, and I use MakerDAO as an example, where there's kind of people coordinating on decisions, but they're all kind of hyper focused on the implementation details. And what kind of ends up lacking is like an overarching vision that everyone can align around. And they end up kind of just nitpicking on specific details and switching back and forth between, MakerDAO case, are they going to be crypto only collateralized, fully decentralized, or are they going to go towards real world assets and go towards more scalable, more centralized assets? It seems like if there's not a mechanism for people to align on a specific vision for the protocol itself, that even if you have necessarily like sub DAOs, like if there isn't an overarching vision between DAOs within an overarching organization, it seems like inevitably there will always be some clash. Do you think there's any structure to resolve the ability to create vision? Is that a governance DAO process itself, or is that more just kind of one DAO imposes on all the other DAOs what the vision is going to be, and you have to accept it or fork yourself out?
Yeah, I think there is, and it's definitely something we've been thinking about a lot. And it does come down to the ability to express your preference. If you can meaningfully share your preference to a shared space and feel like you've had your voice heard, even if the outcome does not necessarily align exactly with what you directly want yourself, if you can be happy with the consensus, and if you're not, you can join a different DAO. And MakerDAO is an interesting one. We could end up seeing a kind of fork there or something, where there seems to be two different clear camps, and that's when things can cause real problems, right? But they've not really, to my view, had the right mechanism to be able to resolve that conflict, because they're just using a kind of forum and occasional yes/no votes. So I do think we're just missing some of the tools there that's necessary to meaningfully capture consensus in a more expressive way. But ultimately, it might come down with, you've got a DAO that's got two different separate camps, and because they are a DAO, they can split and fork and start their own DAO. In fact, sort of Rye is almost a kind of fork of MakerDAO that's gone down this much more governance minimized crypto collateral approach. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see some more migration to Rye, as if things don't pan out in MakerDAO that people want, and that's another way these things can get resolved.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about Rye. It seems like MakerDAO itself, the latest proposal to sell their USDC for ETH, that they're basically trying to go down that model with no peg. But it's interesting to see. It's a conflict.
Like an hour ago or something.
Yeah,
that'll be pretty wild if they do that.
Yeah, like you either want like DAI to be at $1 or you don't. Like there's not really a compromise. It's like there has to be a fork, or everybody has to be forced to a position, which is an interesting dynamic. I don't know if it'll be fully resolved. Yeah,
and sometimes some conflicts are just not resolvable, and we go our own way, and that's kind of what happens in blockchains. But I do think it's possible that, with better, where I think we'll head is, instead of just having this kind of yes/no voting paradigm, we move into more like decentralized decision making, where there's just a much more nuanced way of receiving opinion from a larger group of people. So, not everyone has the right technical knowledge to be able to input on all the important decisions. So, not everyone's opinion is equal on all things. And I think we'll start to see, certainly with reputation dynamics and things like that, I think we'll be able to start to resolve these problems of, we're stuck in this paradigm where the richest people have the loudest voice. And doesn't mean just because they've got a lot of crypto, they know exactly the right thing to do for that decision. So we just need better decision-making tools, I think.
Yeah, I think my last question for you is, we've talked a lot about like the structure of DAOs and how to achieve social consensus and the balances that need to be struck. In terms of like the utility and the purpose of DAOs, a lot of them today have been, how do we govern this protocol? How do we manage these parameters that manage user funds? And then we have kind of like NFT style DAOs where they don't necessarily have a clear purpose, but they're more of just like a social club. Do you see like 5 years down the line that the vast majority, or rather the most influential DAOs, are not necessarily going to be DAOs governing parameters, but rather just DAOs being more like almost like a political group or like a super PAC of greater societal change? Is that going to be a huge area for DAOs in the future? And at that point, how important does the blockchain portion of a DAO become if they're not governing parameters?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a point where the crypto-ness of a DAO becomes less of the primary focus. I think we're very much in this, we're right at the beginning of this Web3 wave, and everyone's super excited about talking about in this very self-referential way about the technology itself. And what we talk about is, blockchains and L1s and L2s and NFTs and all that sort of stuff. And actually it'll just eventually become far more transparent. And for that reason, I think DAOs could be the thing that take us to a kind of mass adoption, because people will be able to join communities that they care about. And crypto is just the backbone that facilitates the mass collaboration. It allows them to achieve goals and fund things that they couldn't do before, and collaborate with people on the internet that they would have never met before. And yeah, I think we'll see like creative institutions arise. I think we'll see social movements, artist movements, music movements, all these sort of huge cultural things can emerge on the internet because they have the tools to be able to fund themselves into existence now. So yeah, absolutely. I think, we've done our job right. If we're building infrastructure, if people just stop talking about the tools themselves so much and just start doing the things that they want to do with them.
I think you guys hit the nail on the head, and I haven't really thought about this a lot, but I think you guys are spot on here in that, especially if you look at the way society is right now, like the current state of overall society, it's in a very weird, polarized, like slight uneasiness about where it's going, unsustainable, like especially in the West at least, feeling. And in a lot of the levers and I think part of it is obviously people are unhappy with the current, management and intermediaries and governments of the world, but also like the tools to enact change have like largely been kind of like eradicated in a way, or become very implausible to actually bring about real change. They've been kind of captured or minimized. And so you have then this like blockchain technology. Not only do you have this new forms of money, you have these new types of applications, and now you have these new organizational structures. And like you guys just said before, like it is really this tool for mass social collaboration around anything. And so like you have this perfect macro environment where people are, looking to enact change, and they're not very happy with the status quo, and that trend is probably going to continue. And then you have this new tool that's available, that I think they're going to want to use once people start to figure out how to use it, and there's better tooling. And so yeah, I could see like super PACs and like big organizations around very specific causes, and you can be pseudo anonymous with them, and there's like a lot of these unique advantages that you can do to solve a very pressing macroeconomic reality that people are growing increasingly unhappy with.
Yeah, I think it is. I agree with you. I think the context is kind of right for this, that we just had the kind of weirdest few years like that you can imagine, really. And we've seen large centralized institutions and governance systems just fail and crumble right in front of our eyes. And I think it's created a context where people want to explore something different, and people do feel disempowered, and they feel worried about centralized power and overreach and authoritarianism. And you're right, there is this new emerging movement on the internet where you can take agency and control over your life and earn money on the internet. And it's like governance without government. And I think people, when they realize it's possible to empower yourself in a system and take agency over a community somewhere, and it might be locally. I think there'll be local DAOs where people start to take control of their own local communities and pool money together and fund things that they want to achieve as a community. So I think there's a desire to see a different paradigm of governance, and the evidence is there right in front of our eyes of why it's needed at the moment. So yeah, I think the context is right for it.
The way I kind of see it is like people within the crypto space are kind of hyper focused on like how can these tools be used for crypto, and I think the actual signal and value of these tools end up kind of get lost in the process, where like NFTs are more than just JPEGs, DeFi is more than just a digital casino, and DAOs are more than just governing crypto parameters, but rather are just tools for which we found an initial product market fit within the crypto ecosystem, because we're already crypto native. But as the user experience gets more simplified and as these systems themselves actually are able to scale both technically and socially, then I think that people end up realizing that crypto is just a facilitator. It's just the backend infrastructure, but it's not why you use the systems, but rather what you can do with the systems. Or that's kind of how I view it. And at least ideally the vision is that more people start to come to that realization that these tools can end up being used to solve problems in the real world, and the speculation of crypto is just a necessary phase for funding development and for testing that these pieces of infrastructure actually work. And so if ideally we can figure out what the pitfalls are and we can solve around those pitfalls within crypto, then it seems like a lot of the same logic can just end up being applied to much greater systems that have more impact on people in their average lives. So it seems like that's the ultimate direction of DAOs, and I think it's helpful for any listeners to kind of zoom out and think about DAOs in a more holistic context. And it seems like that's a lot of what you've been kind of talking about, Nick, in your articles.
Yeah, 100%. I think, yeah, we're very much on the same page there. Yeah, I think we're moving into a phase where we're moving out of this purely speculative crypto bonanza where we're just all flipping tokens for no particular reason. And I think it's the next wave will be driven by us finding those real use cases and having some direct impact in the real world. And I think as soon as people start seeing things like DAOs and things like smart contracts and all the infrastructure we're building here, having a real world impact and doing things that haven't previously been possible because the technology hasn't been there, I think that's when it will really capture the public's imagination, and will I think that we'll see a huge mass adoption of crypto when it's basically transparent and the tools are easy to use, and it will impact your real life, and it'll transform your communities, and you'll find people on the internet and make friends with them and have fun and make money and do all these fun things that haven't been possible before.
I agree with you, but I also think we're also in for the fight that's coming, because this technology is very disrupting to traditional power structures. And so it's going to be very interesting next decade, I think, with this clash of the current power structure and this kind of Web3 disruptive power structure.
Yeah. And, I think I'm hopeful that people will realize there's not much stopping this, in the sense that, digitization, digital transformation of things it's not a direction that's going to slow down. We're heading into an era of automation through AI and, digital impact of the world isn't going to stop. And in fact, we need new ways to solve problems because the problems are just getting bigger and more complex. So yeah, I'm hoping it's going to end up, it's the sort of game theory is it's like collaboration or adversary, right? And the collaborative approach is the one where everyone sort of wins. And if it gets adversarial, then it's just not going to be fun for anyone, and ultimately becomes kind of futile because these are decentralized technologies. And you can't control everyone from stopping them because they're open source protocols. So yeah, I'm hopeful that the right decisions will be made and we find a sort of synergistic way to work with traditional systems and improve themselves and use all this stuff productively. But you're right, it could go the other way. Let's hope it doesn't.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how DAOs evolve over time. I greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast, Nick. I think this was a very interesting discussion. I think there's immense value in DAOs that go beyond just facilitating crypto protocols, and we're kind of seeing just the natural emergence of these new governance structures. Is there any resources or blogs that you would recommend diving into to learn more about DAOs and kind of the complexities and the nuances involved with them?
I'm attempting to write a lot more on DAOs these days. So I have a Substack called the Crypto Space. My Twitter's at Dr. Nick A. Do follow along. I'll happily talk to you all day about DAOs if you want to.
Amazing. Yeah, I would definitely recommend reading some of Nick's articles. They're very, very insightful. I'm not the most focused on governance, more so on the financialization aspect of crypto, but it's always interesting because the governance aspect rules over the financialization and determines really how this technology is going to evolve. So I appreciate you, Nick, coming on, and have a good one, everyone.